Noise is a fact of life. It's inherent in every physical system. Even the light we have captured to make our images is inherently noisy. And while in some circumstances noise can be useful for scientific applications, for the most part, at least for us as photographers and cinematographers, noise is something we are constantly fighting against to get the best looking images without its distraction. What's up everybody, I'm Jason and welcome back to some more tips and tricks for the Canon EOS R5. And today we are going to take a look at the options we have available for in-camera noise reduction when we are shooting video on the EOS R5. Now, for me, at least, it's very hard not to compare the R5 and the R5C. They use the same sensors and processors, they have nearly the same form factors, and quite honestly, I own both of them and I shoot with both of them side by side on a regular basis. However, if you have used both of them side by side, you may have noticed that oftentimes the R5C's images just look better. They're less noisy. Now, part of this is because most of the time the R5C is downsampling from its full 8K sensor resolution, and at least with the R5, what I shoot doesn't. Now, of course, because downsampling takes several pixels, 4 in the case of going from 8K to 4K, and 16 in the case of going from 8K down to 2K, and averages them together, that process itself has a noise-reducing effect. Of course, the R5 can downsample as well when you have it in 4K high-quality mode. However, when you're shooting in 8K or 2K on the R5, downsampling isn't there to help. Moreover, if you shoot in the standard quality 4K mode, again, the camera is line skipping, not downsampling, and so you're not getting that benefit. However, downsampling is not the only way that we can deal with noise. The other way we can do that is to turn to some form of computational noise reduction processing. Now, in its simplest form, noise reduction is just a matter of blurring the image and averaging the surrounding pixels together. Now, of course, this reduces image detail, and that's not something we necessarily want. As a result, most noise reduction algorithms are more sophisticated and use more sophisticated image processing to determine what is detail and what is smooth areas and noise, and then remove the noise without doing the damage to the fine detail. In the video world, this process would be known as spatial noise reduction, and it's called this because we work using the spatial distribution or the spatial information found in each frame independently, that is the X and Y coordinates. However, video isn't just a single frame. It's a continuous sequence of frames made over time, and this introduces a form of temporal locality. That is, something in one frame is likely to be in very nearly or identically the same spot in the next frame. However, because noise is random, the noise in those two frames will differ. As a result, noise reduction algorithms can exploit this time factor to find more information about what is and isn't actually noise. This process is called temporal noise reduction. Now, on the R5C, Canon exposes control over both the spatial and temporal noise reduction settings, as well as providing an automatic mode so you just don't have to deal with it. However, on the R5, Canon provides a much more simplistic noise reduction system. Though I say simplistic, the reality is we don't really know what it does and how it works because that's not documented at all. Now, you might be wondering at this point why I'm talking about all of this and why you should care. After all, noise reduction is noise reduction, isn't it? Well, not quite. Spatial noise reduction, since it involves averaging or blurring the image in one form of another, always has the potential to reduce fine detail in your images or make your image just look smooth or blurry. On the other hand, since temporal noise reduction looks at frames over time, things that move significantly between each frame can potentially produce ghost images or ghost impacts after the noise reduction is being done. Now, while both techniques do reduce noise, what this means is that depending on the scene and the situation you're shooting, you may want to favor one over the other or disable one altogether. This is something that is unfortunately simply not possible with the simplistic noise reduction offered on the R5. Now, where do we find all of this? Well, all of the in-camera noise reduction settings on the EOS R5 are found under the Shoot For menu under the High ISO Noise Reduction, or NR, setting. Entering that sub-menu, you will find there are only 4 options to choose from: off, low, standard, and high. Now, unfortunately, Canon provides very little information about what these settings do or how the noise reduction system works. In fact, if we go to the manual on page 218 where it talks about this, it simply says, you can reduce the image noise generated. This function is especially effective when shooting at high ISO speeds. When shooting at low ISO speeds, noise in the darker parts of the image, shadow areas, can be further reduced. This basically tells us nothing useful. Well, it tells us one thing useful. It does at least imply that the noise reduction function works at all ISOs, not just the high ones as the title implies. However, it also leaves us with a whole bunch of questions, like what exactly is this doing? And arguably more importantly, how well does it work and how does it actually impact our images? Now, to answer these questions, I decided to do some basic qualitative testing. Unfortunately, this isn't as comprehensive or complete as I would like it to be, as I am operating with the same limitations that I discussed in my video on the R5C's noise reduction. Specifically, the libraries that I use for processing video data can only work with 8-bit resolution. And while this is sufficient for many tasks, including machine learning and machine vision, when measuring noise performance, you need to work with the original data, and preferably the original 10-bit data if you have it. So without a good quantitative system, I'm stuck looking at things qualitatively. Now, additionally, unlike the R5C, the R5 can both downsample and line skip in normal operation, and this has an impact on the noise performance as well. And of course, this is where the testing kind of can get really out of hand. So at a minimum, I want to talk about or look at 4K in both high quality and standard modes, so when it's line skipping or not. I think these are probably what most people will be using in general with this camera. However, to make this meaningful for me, I also need to look at 1080p mode, since that's what I use most of the time. So that makes 3 different resolutions with 4 different noise reduction settings each, or 12 tests for every ISO that I choose to test. Which brings me to talking about ISOs. I need to look at more than just one, otherwise this doesn't really help us. So for ISOs, I chose to look at 800, 1600, 3200, and 25,600. Now, I chose ISO 800 because it is the base ISO for Canon Log 3 recording, and this is where I shoot the most. In fact, this is where I have my studio set to give me light for. I chose ISO 1600 and 3200 because they are also ISOs I frequently find myself shooting at. Again, at least in the studio, specifically when shooting at higher frame rate than 30 or 24 frames per second. Finally, I chose 25,600. It is the highest non-expanded ISO on the R5 when shooting video, and it also happened to be where I had my ISO limit set on the camera when shooting video, so when I went all the way up as far as it could go, I couldn't go to 25,600. 51,200. That's what I meant. Anyway, all told, that ends up being 12 tests per ISO, 4 ISOs total for a total of 48 individual tests. So yeah, the testing took a while, even though this is just quantitative. And of course, none of this can be easily automated, and there is a ton of room to mess things up by not changing a setting or changing it incorrectly. So it's not like this is just a mindless plow through a bunch of recordings and then I'm done. Anyway, for all of the tests, I tried to keep the camera settings as consistent as possible. Everything was shot at f2.8 with a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. The only exception to this were the ISO 1600 tests. These were shot at 1/100th of a second, largely because I don't have a single stop neutral density filter. Now, to control my exposures, that's what I used, neutral density, specifically Polar Pro variable neutral density exposures to dial in what I needed to get things where they needed to be. Now for camera settings, everything was shot in Canon Log 3 using the BT709 color primaries. This also means, because it's an R5, that everything is 10-bit and in 422 chroma subsampling and recorded in HEVC. Now I did use IPB compression instead of all I, But again, it's qualitative, not quantitative, and I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference when it comes to looking at some footage. Now, finally, since these are log files, and because the visual effect that a log curve has on a file in terms of flattening contrast is that the noise appears less visible or less obvious in the ungraded version. So I am showing both the graded and ungraded versions in each of these demos. Now, I have arranged the tests so that each level of noise reduction is shown in comparison with the unnoised reduction version of the same ISO and settings. And finally, just for kicks, I also wanted to take a look at the difference between the R5 and the R5C's noise reduction. Now, this is not a fair test to either of the cameras or a fair test at all. I am comparing ISO 25600 on the R5 to ISO 51200 on the R5C, and you really shouldn't do that if you're trying to be scientific, but I just wanted to see how that shook out. That said, both samples are 100% crops of 4K downsampled video. Both were shot Canon Log 3 with BT709 color primaries, and they have both been shown in graded and ungraded form. Now, in looking through the test footage, it seems to me that the R5's noise reduction system, if there's one thing I can say about it on the plus, is that it does a reasonably good job of not obliterating image detail. Even in the ISO 25600 test at high, it is not obviously blurring everything into oblivion on the focus target and in the texture on the plastic Color Check Pro, or Passport. Now, that said, overall, I am vastly less impressed with the performance, especially at the ISOs of 1600 and 3200. Even with the camera set to high, I still see quite a lot of noise in those tests, and quite honestly, this reflects what I have seen in practice when working with both R5 and R5C footage. Though, honestly, even looking at that vastly unfair R5 versus R5C comparison, I still think the R5C did a better job there, and that was at a stop higher ISO. Now, in both of these images, the camera is set to downsample, so that's certainly not what's making the difference. That leaves either the noise reduction that the R5C and the Cinema EOS OS has, or possibly the R5C's thermal solution as making a difference here. And this is one thing that I have wanted to look into for quite some time and just never had the foresight to get around to. Thermal noise is a thing, and the warmer the sensor is, the more noise you'll see in images. Many people, due to shooting video and due to cinema cameras, tended to dismiss the active cooling on the R5C as being stupid or silly. But it does keep the sensor's temperature both lower and more stable, which of course means less thermal noise. It also means that take 50 is going to have the same noise as take 1. And while it doesn't seem like it should make that much of a difference, I have, at least in my experience, seen it. Back when I was doing a lot of bird photography in the late 2000s, I could generally tell if a day was hotter or cooler simply by looking at how much noise there was in the sky of my images. So a few degrees external temperature difference can certainly make a noticeable difference in images if you are looking for it. So, with the results in hand, what are my recommendations here? And truthfully, this is a bit of a hard call for me. I don't really see that much of a difference between the three noise reduction levels. Yes, there is some, especially above ISO 3200. However, below that, the reality is the effect appears fairly minimal. Personally, I've turned the setting up to high on my R5, as I don't see a real strong negative for doing so. At least not with the images that I shoot at the resolutions that I shoot it at. Now, that said, I also find that I still need to do post-production noise reduction to get my R5 footage to seamlessly intercut with my R5Cs. So it's not the an end-all solution in that respect. Now that said, if you are shooting at very high ISOs and are using AI-driven noise reduction, like what's found in Topaz Labs' Video AI, You might want to consider turning this off completely so that the post-processing noise reduction software has unaltered data to work with and not whatever the camera blurred or smeared out because of its simpler processing. In any event, with that said, I'm going to wrap this up here. This has been the in-camera noise reduction video side on the EOS R5. If you found this useful or at least interesting, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you aren't already. Finally, if you'd like to support this channel and future videos like this one, please consider hitting that thanks button if you can, or buying yourself something you've always wanted using one of the affiliate links below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.